Howard Green is a 4-time best-selling author and 2-time finalist for the National Business Book Award. During his 33-year broadcasting career, Howard was best known as the founding anchor at Business News Network, where he hosted the flagship interview program. Over his 15 years there, he conducted approximately 14,000 interviews, from a guy called Mark Carney to Alan Greenspan to Tony Blair to Richard Branson, and of course Rick Waugh, the main character in his latest book. Howard's a 2-time Emmy nominee and winner of the Gemini Award for his documentary, The Investigation of Swiss Air 111. Howard is also an adjunct professor of business history at Schulich School of Business and an executive communications coach who assists a range of C-suite leaders with their presentations. He previously served on the board of the Canadian Journalism Foundation and for 8 years was an ambassador and special advisor to the chair of Dyslexia Canada. He has degrees from Carleton University in Ottawa and Columbia University in New York, where in 2006 he was honored with the Knight Bagehot Fellowship. Gimme a Crisis is his 4th book and was an instant Globe and Mail bestseller. And I would also note, I warned Howard I'd do this, that I know him as a TV star on What's New, so when I watched him as a little kid. So that dates me, but it also dates Howard too, so I think it's okay. Welcome, Howard.
Thanks for that, Andrew. And that was when I had brown hair. And I'm going to mention it, actually. But thank you, everybody, for being here today. Great organization, and I've always enjoyed being associated with it. And thank you, Joanne, for inviting me, Ryan, for the invitation. And I, too, would like to tip my hat to Red Wilson. He had such an enormous impact on the study of business history. His generosity was incredible. He made Canada a better place. And Dimitri, who's not here, I guess he's teaching a class, somebody said. Some of you already know he's publishing a book about Red this spring, so I think in May. So I hope you all get a copy of it. I had a sneak preview of it, so I hope you all dig into that one. I'd also like to give my thanks to Joe, who's not here. I'm sorry that I'm missing him today, and I'm sorry he's not feeling well. I consider Joe the godfather of Canadian business history in this country. It's hard to say no to Joe, and that's a good thing. His commitment seems limitless, and we all wouldn't be here today, I don't think, at this event without him. Truly a great Canadian. And from a personal standpoint, I want to thank Joe because he was essentially, not only is the godfather of business history, but he was the midwife, I would say, of this new book, Gimme a Crisis. So he's a godfather and a midwife, which is kind of an interesting, maybe tell him that after. And he's a great friend. Anyhow, in July of 2023, Rick and I had stayed in touch. We'd known each other 21 years or whatever, going back to BNN. And where he used to bug him on air about his compensation all the time. It kind of became a shtick between us. And Joe called me, and I knew of his interest in business history, and he said, give Rick a call. So I did, and abracadabra, or almost abracadabra, within a few months I was writing the book. But a week later, I was actually up at Rick's cottage. He calls it a cottage. We would call it something a little bit more. And just to sort of hear what he had to say and his ideas were and so forth. And it was like 3 hours. We're in his office, in his home office at the cottage, and he's in a reclining chair. And as the afternoon went on, he's further and further back in the recliner, and I'm starting to think like I'm the shrink here, and he's like unload. And I thought to myself, okay, he's ready to talk. And so, it kind of went from there. But I also want to go back to Joe because Joe's own research and writing about Canadian business history was fundamental to me. His writing, along with the late Chris Kobrak, invaluable to me for foundational work on this book. But I'm just going to spool back because, and then I'll take a long run up to the book itself, but just spool back to some background, which sets the stage for my books, and specifically this book. standing here in front of you today is probably like the last place I ever expected to be. And by way of backstory, my parents, my mom's still living. I just came back from being with her all last week. She's 97 and not doing too well, but she's still with it, and she knows I'm speaking here today. They wanted me, I think, not explicitly, but they expected me to be a doctor, like my father. It was kind of a family business. His brother was also a doctor. My mom's two brothers were psychiatrists, and so there was a lot of doctoring going on. And even though I got into pre-med at Queen's, deep down I knew I would be a terrible doctor. It's lucky for all of you that I did not go into medicine. The human race is much better off. Instead, I was very interested in stories. I grew up with stories, like all of us grew up with stories, but perhaps certain types of stories had a bigger impact on me, and I'm setting all of this up with regard to these books. But so my second earliest memory was the Kennedy assassination. It was a pretty big story, still talked about. And my first 18 years before I went to journalism school at Carleton, there was a mention of Carleton, woo, woo, woo. We think now there's a blur of news, and there is. I mean, every hour or every 5 minutes, that guy's tweeting something, and it seems to be news. But that period, those 18 years leading up to university, were also a period of a lot of news, big news. I mentioned the JFK assassination. There were the Beatles shortly afterwards. There was the Canadian flag. There was the Vietnam War. Color TV came in, They had a C in the TV guide for the color shows. Expo 67. The Summer of Love, Martin Luther King's death, unfortunately, another Kennedy shortly afterwards, Apollo 11, Pierre Trudeau, the October crisis, Richard Nixon, Watergate. And then on the business side, there was the OPEC energy crisis of the 70s and lineups for gasoline, the arrival of Japanese cars, and the pushing aside the decline of the big three, which have been so fundamental to the economic engine here in North America. And tons of stories. And our home was full of these because, my parents were news junkies. The radio was on at breakfast, news. The radio was on at supper. There was more news. We had the morning paper. We had the afternoon paper. We watched the news at night. Newsweek came every week. Maclean's came every week. And I mentioned my mom, she was not only a history grad, she did a master's in history when she was pregnant with my little brother. There were four of us, and he was the fourth, so she was raising four kids, and she was doing a master's in Canadian history, but she also got a journalism degree from King's the first year, 1965, that they gave them, and all of that left an impression on me. So despite all of this doctoring that was going on, my career was more influenced by my mom. And interesting, when I was there in December, I bought her J.D.M. Stewart's new book, The Prime Ministers, because of her interest in history. And I showed it to her. I said, Mom, this is a new book, and maybe you'll like it. And she looked at it, and there are all those pictures of the prime ministers on the front. And she said, Howard, I remember most of those guys. And I calculated at 97, she's been alive for like 63% of Canadian history. But I told her that. Anyway, I decided to go to journalism school. And by the way, she read the manuscript for Gimme a Crisis in June, just before it went to the printer. And by the way, Andrew here, who Andrew mentioned, was my great sounding board on the book, my historical consultant, and invaluable to me. But I gave Mom the manuscript, and she finished it about a day and a half. And the first thing she said, I found 2 typos. So I thought, this is good, This is good that she's still with it and she's helping, because you need a lot of eyes for these things. Anyway, I decided to go to journalism school. I knew nothing about it, other than my late sister Susan had gone there 7 years before for an arts degree. And the place sounded fun, sounded like a bit of a party university, like a big high school, really. Ottawa seemed interesting. There was Parliament, Trudeau the First, the canal for skating, and it was about double the size of Halifax where I grew up, so it was manageable jump for me, because U of T, I think, would have been too much for me, to be honest with you. But in addition to journalism, I did a minor in economics, which has always been a fascinating subject to me, but it was absolutely miserably taught. It was miserably taught. I took 6 or 7 courses there, and incredibly I stayed interested because of what it's about. And for me, it's not about graphs and numbers, it's about behavior. And so I was a bit of an outlier. I wasn't an economist, and I was a bit weird as a budding journalist because most journalism students, my observation, and therefore journalists, don't gravitate towards numbers and math. Now, you see Doug Gould back here, business journalist for a long time, one of those who gravitated. So, and thankful to him for all his great coverage. But for the majority, I think, of journalists, business is viewed as boring. And, you know, they're wordsmiths. They're interested in politics. They're, not that I'm not. But the arts, not that I'm not. Wars, novels, and so forth, and sports maybe. But being interested in business, I think, gave me a bit of a competitive advantage because there weren't as many people interested in covering it. And it was beginning to emerge as a subject to cover, as it should be, because, you know, when you think about it, there are really only, in my view, a few major power levers. You've got politics here, you've got business here. I'm just putting them in these spots, you know, like at the end of barbells. And in some parts of the world, religion. Maybe in some parts of the world, we're reading about Mexico now, organized crime. You know, these are all power levers. So if you covered business, you were covering something important. But, you know, before that, I covered some general news for a few years. And I kind of thought about it, and I thought, anything that moved, anything that broke, anything that burned, died, or was stolen, you know, that was news. You know, fires, helicopter crashes, strikes, whatever. Strikes were connected to business, obviously, because there was money involved. But you had to take these, and in a day, you had to bang them out for the evening news, a minute and a half at the time. You gathered, you digested, and you synthesized really fast, which was great, you know, practice and for storytelling, training for storytelling, which is what writing a book is all about. You know, there's a lot of low wattage material, if I can put it that way, but you learn a skill. You find out something and you report it. And that's what I've done in a variety of forms for 45 years now. Absorb and synthesize. And really, it's as simple as that. You know, there's a lot of complexity, but at its core, that's what it is. You know, for the evening news, for documentaries, for BNN, for my 4 books, same basic process. And I like to say that I write for everyone. I said this at the book launch. You know, I quoted historian David McCullough, who's no longer with us. He said, I write books that I want to read. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly it. And while I respect academia, I am something different. I don't pretend to be an academic at all. I'm a storyteller who tries to, and Andrew will tell me whether I did or not, apply a bit of academic rigor to my work. And as I was thinking about this, I think there might be a lesson here that journalists can use a little bit of academic rigor, and academics can use a bit of, you know, what us hacks do in terms of storytelling. Anyway, after a few years in the news around the Atlantic provinces, I got a job that really taught me how to tell a story. And that was what's new, what you mentioned, back when I had brown hair, between 83 and 88. I hosted and produced segments for this CBC news magazine show, weekly half hour for adolescents. And it was on, actually, for 17 years, and I was there for 5. And we had a huge audience for the time, especially for now. It was about 400,000 people per week. Sounds like you were one of them. I was one of them. And it was used in civics classes across the country. And we distilled the big news of the week for a youth or, adolescent audience. The stories of the time, like there was a civil war in Lebanon. The Sandinistas and the Americans were going at it, Nicaragua. Free trade, right? Acid rain. Mulroney was in power. Reagan was in power. We boiled all those down. We had maps, we had history and stories. And so much so that adults watched it because they couldn't understand the National at night. Or, the National stretched their, there was a lot assumed on the National. And the key with adolescence was don't assume prior knowledge. Don't condescend. Talk straight. Otherwise, you're going to lose them. And I have found that actually works for everyone. And I carried that MO right through to when I hosted on BNN, and through my career after that into writing books. With BNN, I knew that the PMO was watching. Harper had it on in his office. The clerk of the Privy Council told me that. And CEOs and money managers were watching. And John and Martha Smith, I'm making up that name, in Moose Jaw were watching because their portfolio was at stake. So I'd always try to make it clear without dumbing it down, simple, but not simplistic. And I try to do that with my books. There's a big difference between simple and simplistic. I mean, think about Warren Buffett, for instance. He talks in the simplest of ways, but he's talking about complex things. Yet it's never simplistic. So, still spooling back, in 1988, when I left that show, I needed a job, and I wasn't going to go back to local news. No way. So, perhaps subconsciously, I was thinking, about that minor in economics that I had. And I went to see the executive producer of a show called Venture. Doug, you'll remember Venture. And so, a half-hour weekly business show on CBC, Sunday nights, just after the National. I hadn't actually thought of it until preparing these remarks, but Venture, I think, is now part of Canadian business history. And there's probably a paper in it for somebody here because there's 20 years of items there. And I think Donald Trump's actually in the vault there. Scully, I think, did an interview with Trump at one point.
My wife, as a matter of fact.
Pardon me?
As did my wife.
Did Libby do that? Yes. Oh, okay. Anyway, I mean, Trump got around, still gets around. Anyway, the show started in 1985. Patrick Watson was the first host of all things for 2 years. And then by 88, it was starting to get its footing. That's when I went. Even though at the CBC there were a lot of harumphers about it. The Fifth Estate and the Journal, we are the important shows, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the truth is Mulroney was in power, and he didn't like the CBC that much, at least at the time. And so CBC threw him a bone, and they created a business show. And it lasted about 20 years, and it was a very big success. It made money for the CBC. Bread and butter was following entrepreneurs and making mini documentaries about them. But the entrepreneurs got bigger and bigger over time, as the show, gathered steam. And it also did cover stories, big issues of the week, like, say, free trade in 88, 89. And I was 29 covering the free trade agreement, going to Washington, interviewing important people like Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Democratic Lion, and doing a stand-up in front of the White House wearing a trench coat. And people were saying, I've got a friend, Don Ferguson, that you might remember from the Air Farce, and geez, is that the kid from the kids show out in front of the White House? Anyway, so this was precursor to USMCA or CUSMA, precursor to NAFTA. We didn't have a comprehensive free trade agreement before that. We had auto since '65. Dimitri's the expert on that, but no comprehensive agreement. Anyhow, I did 10 years there while concurrently doing documentaries for other shows. And, while that show, the kids show, taught me how to approach a story, documentaries taught me how to structure large amounts of material, which is what you do when you write books. When you put Gimme a Crisis together, that's what you're doing. And so in particular, you mentioned Swiss Air 111. I did a particular fascination with air crashes because in 1981 I was alone on a Saturday night in the CBC newsroom in St. John's, and I heard over the scanner, "Bring more body bags." And I still get a chill about it. And I went out to this terrible accident, and 4 people killed. But I thought to myself, okay, they're going to investigate this. How do you find out what went wrong that caused this? And so what happened and why? And isn't that the essence of history? What happened and why? And so fast forward to, I did one on the science of investigation. This was for Suzuki's show, Nature of Things. And then Swiss Air 111 in 1998. It was a 4-year investigation. 229 people died when the plane went down off Peggy's Cove, 555 kilometers an hour into the water. Huge plane, 2 million pieces at the bottom of the ocean, 4-year investigation, 200 tapes after 4 years of shooting, 100 hours of footage. What's the story? How do you put this together, And it's the same question you start with on every one of these projects. Give me a crisis, no exception. Why should I care? Right? Everything flows from that. The focus and then the structure. Then you fill it in, the what happened and why. So when it came to write books, even though I hadn't written one, I told a lot of stories. You put a lot of story miles on the odometer, and you've structured a lot of stories. And then, with BNN, that was the blossoming of the so-called specialty channels in the 90s. My boss at Venture left, Duncan McHugh, and you remember Duncan, Doug. He wrote the application for a business TV channel, which Canada didn't have. And he asked me to make the video for the CRTC application, and it was tied to the Globe's ROB. It was initially called ROB TV, Report on Business Television, which is the preeminent business publication, obviously, since the early 60s here. CNBC proved a business channel could work, so off we went, starting September 1st, 99. Wallpapering the airwaves with business news, and it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible at first, the first year. We were in this dump at Carlton and Jarvis. A pigeon was flying around the studio, unloading on one of our hosts, and I won't name anyone. And Ali Velshi was one of my colleagues there at the time. They only gave us a 4-month contract because they didn't know whether it would work. They were going to pull the plug after 4 months. But, Nortel was going like this. Research in Motion was going like that. NASDAQ, there was lots going on. Izzy Sharp, founder of Four Seasons Hotels and Resorts, came. Our studio was across the street from his very first hotel, which was on Jarvis Street in the early 60s. That was business history. John Cleghorn of RBC came. That was business history. Jim Balsillie of Research in Motion, now BlackBerry, came in with, literally what was then, before the BlackBerry we all know, it was like a little pager. And he came bounding into the studio. I remember the stock was $60 that day. After the interview, it was $80. And, it was business history. Nortel, dot-com, boom, collapse. 9/11 changed everything in 2 years. People started to watch us instead of CNBC. And in the meantime, I started to develop a bit of a specialty there, interviewing CEOs and major CEOs, our first big sponsorship. And, pardon me, and I developed relationships. And all 4 of my books, including this one, come from those relationships. Every one of them. My first book, the TD book, Banking on America, dated to a venture segment in 1996 on Greenline, the brokerage, and buying Waterhouse in the U.S., which gave TD the money to buy Canada Trust, which brought Ed Clark in, and then he went and bought in the United States. And I met key characters who became, key people rather, became key characters in the book. And then new characters like Ed Clark, who I interviewed on BNN. And then my second book, still, Charles Bronfman, again, met him on the show. And, 4 or 5 years later, after, getting to know each other, I'm writing his memoir with him. Hunter Harrison, railroader, same thing, a dozen years of getting to know him, then a book. And Rick Waugh, the CEO of Scotia. As I said, 20 plus years of knowing him, then a book. And so I want to say one more thing about these relationships. They imply another word. And it's a very simple 5-letter word. I haven't seen it on Wordle yet, but maybe I will. Trust. It's trust. When you write about people like this, and anybody, and when you interview them as extensively as I have to do for these books, it's about trust. It's hundreds of hours of interviews with these people. And oral history, which is really the basis for all of my books. I mean, there's documents and there's articles and everything else, but the core of it are all of these interviews. That involves trust. But that also, obviously, I mean, we're a history association, that has flaws, right? Because memory is involved. And a memory doesn't necessarily equal the truth. Memory is what we think the truth is. It's what we remember as the truth, or what we want to remember as the truth. And other people remember it differently, or often not at all. In Rick's case, so there's a picture in there of a guy named Bill Nix, who was the CEO of Scotia from the late 50s until the early 70s, when he had a massive heart attack and died. But he is the guy who got the bank into the gold business. I'll talk more about that in a sec. And there was a picture, Rick said, you got to see this picture of Nix. He's on the cover of Time magazine. And, geez, I look around, I'm searching, we searched Time magazine, archives at the bank, looking around, nothing. And I was, you sure? Oh, yeah. And somebody else said it. And then I looked on eBay for this cover. This is what history involved, reporting history. So I look on eBay, Bill Nix magazine cover, gold. Up pops Business Week, which is now owned by Bloomberg, and there's Bill Nix in a I don't know, does he look like Gregory Peck to you in that, with the cigarette and the blue double-breasted thing out in front of a vault with all these gold bars? It's right in there. Anyway, I took a picture of the thing on eBay. It was $18 to buy the cover, and I took a picture of it on my iPhone. And then that's the picture that's in the book. But we paid Bloomberg, I think, $750 for the rights, because they now own it. They didn't have the original negative. But he said, geez, I said to Rick, it was on Business Week. He said, I've been going around telling everybody it was Time. Anyway, so, that's memory for you, right? And then, he was telling me all about the financial crisis. And we were going to buy, Howard, we were going to buy this 10th biggest bank in the United States down in Cleveland. I was negotiating with the comptroller of the currency. And then Obama came in and he brought in TARP, which gave the American banks cheap, free money, basically. Our cost of capital was here. Theirs was here. We couldn't compete. We backed out. I said, Obama, I said. It wasn't it Bush? It was Bush. Geez, I've been going around telling everybody it was Obama. Anyway, so, so memory is a tricky bit of business. But, there's backup, obviously. The real historians in here. Other books, other people's work, articles, official documents, diaries. I had access to diaries, journals, photos, videos. And while each of my books has something in common about the business and about the relationships, the fruit of those relationships, each is different. They're not cookie cutter, at least I don't think so. Banking on America has a few characters, main characters in a supporting cast, written in the third person, the story of how TD became big in the U.S. Distilled is Charles's memoir, Bronfman's memoir, written in first person, in his voice. But I insisted, and he agreed, to his credit, and he kept his word, to discussing very difficult personal matters. The loss of the company, family matters, strained family relationships, getting steamrolled by his brother and his nephew. Tough stuff. It was really a book about a family pathology. And a protagonist, Charles, while he was an heir to billions, struggled with that pathology all his life. And then there was Railroader, about Hunter Harrison, a biography, about a guy determined to change an industry, a century-old industry, more than a century-old industry, no matter who he pissed off. Customers, regulators, boards, unions, even his wife. And I saw that firsthand at their house. It was, if I have to summarize it, it was the story of a shit disturber. That's what that book is, 300 pages, but as applied to railroads. Now, Gimme a Crisis, it's not a biography, but it does have a main driving character, and that's Rick, who ran the bank for 10 years through the financial crisis and other calamities like default of Argentina, bailout of the Dominican, and so forth. Dealt with a social crisis of massive proportions, the treatment of women in the workplace. That's the last chapter in the book. It's called, Does She Mind Going Down One Floor? And that's a reference to the fact that there was no women's washroom on the executive floor of the bank when he joined it, and for many years. And, the only people allowed on the floor were men, unless they were secretaries. And so Rick was central to helping advance women at the bank. And actually, it's his favorite chapter in the book, come to think of it. So, the book has a main character with a large ensemble cast. Other executives, other bank CEOs like Gord Nixon, Bill Down, who were running, Royal Bank and BMO at the time. Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan. Regulators, central bankers, and Rick's wife, Lynn, who was, central to his career. Each book is different because it required a different treatment. And even though Distilled, the Bronfman book, is a memoir, I would put all of them in the category, broadly speaking, of narrative nonfiction, written with novel-like approaches, storytelling, but based, in fact, as best I could, and based on witness testimony, those interviews. In my view, there's almost a bit of a Venn diagram between narrative nonfiction and fiction. Narrative nonfiction uses some of the tools of fiction, the storytelling, while the best fiction, in my view, I think, has the ring of truth. So funnily enough, there are certain commonalities, and there are always places where the rubber hits the road. There's a phase, and it happens every time. Every time. They get sick of me. I'd get sick of me. And I tell them that at the beginning. You're going to get sick of me. Nah. But they do. The little bugger won't let go of that damn question. He keeps coming back. And, that would be Hunter, for instance. He had a very short fuse. For a guy who pissed off everybody else, he was very sensitive to any criticism or suggestions. In Jacksonville, Florida, when they'd taken over CSX, the last railroad he ran, I brought a whole sheaf of quotes from other people I'd been talking to. We were well into the process, and, criticisms and questions or different takes on what he had told me. And he didn't like that one bit. And he said, I'm quoting him here, forgive my color for a bit. He said, well, shit, Howard. He's talking this Tennessee accent. Well, shit, Howard. If that's the way it's going to be, there ain't going to be no goddamn book. And so, we'll calm down and let's talk about it. Or Rick, to be honest with Rick. I told him, like I tell all of them at the outset, this is a lot of hours. And I told him roughly how many. And it's going to be endless questions. And, we ask Rick one question, it goes on, the answer goes on. Laughing up there in the back. So anyway, his wife Lynn says, yeah, you know how to make a short story long. And so he talks about that himself. So anyway, we're 6 months into the process. And I'm on a 2-hour call with him in the Turks and Caicos. He's in the Turks, I'm here. And it's 80 degrees here, Howard, thanks. Anyway, he got me, he said, how much more time do you need? We're 6 months into the process. How much more time do you need? He said, I've been giving you all this material for free. Well, I mean, that was the deal. You know, they don't get it until they do. And you stay firm, and they calm down, because deep down, they want to be heard. Right? There is a deep human need to be understood. One of the worst feelings is to be misunderstood. And they, you know, they've accomplished things and they want people to know about them. And they're too far into it by then, you know. So, okay, all right, calm down, and away you go. But, you know, the other key component to writing these books, I think, sounds corny, but it's love. You have to love the story, or else it'll kill you. It will kill you. It's so much damn work to write these. You don't want to get a year in and think, what the hell did I, you know, sign on to here? Because you got another year or two to go. And it's torture. So, sure, you know, there are always moments of doubt with any major project, a complicated project. And there always will be, but that's different. You know, I love all my books, and I still love them. And that's why I can come out to events like this and talk enthusiastically about them still, because I love them. And the latest, Gimme a Crisis, it's personal history. You know, it's his history. It's banking history. It's Canadian history. It's class history. It's social history. It's sports history, because the Raptors are in there. It's international history, because of the financial crisis, Argentina, the Dominican. It's history, very simply. And this has actually made me wonder, maybe it's something for another day, but whether we should ghettoize business history. I don't know if that's blasphemous to suggest, to even ask that here, but does the phrase business history attract people or push them away? I don't know. Because it's hard to beat these stories. And for those who think business is boring, they are wrong. You know, there are a couple of chapters in Gimme a Crisis that should be a movie. Argentina, the global financial crisis, you know, or a 3-part streaming series. I mean, how often do you get an inside look at running a global bank from a CEO's perspective? Never. Never. That's the why I should care. Because you're in there. And you're seeing it. And as much as they might irritate us, banks are important. Credit is the bloodstream of the economy. I think that's the phrase I use in the book. Without banks, no economy. And the stories and the issues, like, does she mind going down one floor, are endless. And the banks, of course, are tied into every aspect of our society. And amazing things, you know, some of this comes from Joe and Chris's work. You know, it was an industry, the banking industry here, was an industry that was against the establishment of the Bank of Canada. I mean, this is, you know, this is an organization that helped save them in the crisis. And it was an industry that didn't do mortgages until the 50s. It was an industry, as I said, that didn't allow women to participate, and like so many other, broadly speaking, across society. You couldn't be part of the pension fund at a Canadian bank if you worked there if you were a woman until the 1960s. 1967 for Scotia, 63 for RBC. Appalling. So, you know, then the 80s and 90s when he was in the U.S. lending before he came back to Canada and moved up the chain, Canadian banks were bigger than American banks because American banks hadn't consolidated yet. And Scotia and TD were huge lenders to American cable TV. And then there were the ones you didn't loan to. Rick turned down a guy named Donald Trump for a loan. And I suspect, although I don't know for a fact, that probably Trump went to some other Canadian banks and got the same answer. But anyway, a leopard doesn't change its spots. So that's a great story right there. And then there are the Raptors. Who here knows that Scotiabank was one of the original owners of the Raptors, 30 years ago? You do. 10%, no cheating. But how do you put together a winning bid for a sports franchise, a professional sports franchise? Rick was in the middle of that, and it was really all about relationships between the major investors that he had to navigate. And it was a funny side note because a former CEO of Alcan was on the Scotia board, and he didn't think it was such a great idea. He was opposed. He said that, there are three things which bring down companies. A corporate jet. So they had just bought a corporate jet. Brand new real estate. They're sitting in Scotia Plaza, which is brand new. And buying sports teams. 3 strikes right there. Anyway, it worked, and they probably should have held their share because it's worth a fortune now. But, my wife, Lynn, same name and spelling as Rick's wife, couldn't care less about sports. Couldn't care less. But she loved the Raptor chapter because, I call it the Raptor chapter, because she said, so that's how things work. All the relationships and how things coalesced around these relationships. And then there were the crises. Argentina. That's the backstory. There's a backstory there about how the bank became so international. It goes back to that guy, Nix, I mentioned earlier. When Rick ran the bank, it was in 55 countries. And the answer is because they got in the gold business. Nix put them in the gold business. Trading it, storing it for central banks around the world, for instance. And then, Peru says, you're storing our gold. Why don't you lend $3 million to our national steel company? Which is exactly what happened in 65 or 66. That was their first big loan in South America. Or the Greek shipping industry. Bank started in Halifax. Greek ships come in. They know about Scotiabank. How about lending to us, And they did. I couldn't get out of Rick. He was very careful about giving, any client names. I said, did the bank lend to Aristotle Onassis? I wouldn't say. But anyway, involvement in all those countries, portfolio approach, diversification. Rick was very big on risk, how much you could lose rather than how much you could make. Big part of risk management is diversification. 55 countries. It's narrowed now. It's down, 20-something. And you need it because like loans, countries blow up or go bad. And Argentina was the case in point for Scotia. 2001, 2002. It had gotten lured into buying a bank there in the 90s. Just as, it was recovering from the Falklands and everything. But, of course, it's Argentina, and the wheels always come off that economy. So get this for business history. This is a country that has defaulted 9 times since independence. You do that once, it's terrible for a country, a trauma. You do it 9 times, it's chronic. Huge bouts of hyperinflation to the point that the computers at the bank couldn't handle 4-digit interest rates in the thousands. Anyway, 2001, 2002, a few years before, Brazil went in the tank. Argentina very tied to Brazil. Argentina's economy flops. People are pulling their money out of banks, sending it to Uruguay, where it's safer. Scotia's bank there is in trouble. It was the first that had to make an interest payment on its bonds to foreign investors. But that was now illegal because the Argentinian government had put currency controls on. The CEO, then Peter Godso, was burned in effigy, as was a guy named Alan MacDonald, who ran the bank there. And terrifying for him because he was held without legal representation. And employees were mugged. I talked to one, she was the head of risk, Donna Grosskorth. She was grabbed around the neck coming out of a grocery store. Knife. Argentinians were dying in the streets. very close to Scotia's headquarters. There were 5 presidents of the country in 13 days. If that doesn't say chaos, I don't know what does. And Rick was head of international, so he was executive in charge. And they saved the jobs of about 2/3 of the employees, about 1,700 employees, and they saved about 1,200 jobs. Government suspended the bank, it combined with another bank, and they lost the bank. Took a big write-down. There were years of legal stuff went on and a settlement. Anyway, there was the finale was a daring escape on the bank's jet, which had to be parked in Uruguay across the water because Argentina, they thought, would seize the jet if it landed there. They could sell it for US dollars. Anyway, it was perhaps the most searing event of his career. Could have wrecked his career, but he handled it calmly. He handled it well. And people there, who've talked to me about it. And it would be a rehearsal for other crises. There was the bailout of the Dominican Republic a year later, after a massive bank fraud there cratered the nation's economy. The IMF needed a credible foreign bank to come in and help with the take over the assets. And Scotia had been there since the early 1900s, so you're it. And former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge, who later served on the bank's board, told me that Scotia was like the IMF of the Caribbean. And by the way, it still has 30% of the deposits in that region. Then, of course, the biggest chapter in the book, the global financial crisis, 07 to 09. We talk about 08, but it was really that bracketed by those 2 years. When everything was on the edge of the cliff, Rick focused on liquidity. He'd be at international meetings with bankers from all over the world, and he'd say, I read the body language, Howard, and it was not pretty. These were freaked out CEOs, people from Ireland, Iceland, or, UK, American. So he called up the treasurer of the bank, a guy named Bob Brooks, who passed away a little while ago. Fortunately, I talked to him not long before he died. Gave me a fantastic 2-hour interview. Incredible person. He managed the bank's balance sheet, and Rick said to him, Bob, I don't know what's going on, but make sure you got lots of liquidity. This was like late 07. Brooks, as I said, is no longer with us, but he described a harrowing period of trying to fund the bank on a daily basis due to huge US dollar exposure given their large US lending book. But they didn't have branches in the States, so they didn't have a natural source of retail funding for the bank. Here, branches, retail funding, smaller than the others, but they had it. So Brooks told me he'd go home and wonder, would the commercial paper that was helping fund the bank, would it roll again? Would it renew the next day? And he described personally calling Boeing himself and saying, you got any money lying around that you can deposit in the bank? And so, the foreign central banks in Asia and so forth, same thing, hedge funds, whatever, who you could get to deposit. Rick said he was a lot less alarmed than Brooks, who had to deal with the U.S. balance sheet. Rick felt, okay, Canada's solid. That's where most of our bank is. We got a mortgage portfolio that's solid. But he did tell me Friday afternoons were the worst. And that's the title of that chapter, Chapter 8, on the financial crisis. He had a rule. Any problem, one of his reports had, through the week, that could not be solved, you better bring it to me on Friday. And then we're going to work on it on the weekend, and I'm going to get involved, and we're going to get it solved before Monday morning. I'm thinking, this is how you run a big bank? Jesus. Anyway, I said, did that not make, was that not a little... Anyway, he said, no, that's what you paid the big bucks for, Howard, or something, flip like that. But he said, the president makes a decision to send troops, or the general decides when to invade, whatever. And he didn't see it as any different. He was a very calm guy in many respects. So he also described, he and other bank CEOs of the period, constant meetings with Carney, who was governor of the Bank of Canada. It's in his diary. Jim Flaherty was finance minister. Osfy, to keep the system together. And normally bankers talking together, 5, 6 of them, the big 6 in a room could be viewed as collusion. But as Rick described, they were having these conversations in front of the political and regulatory authorities for the good of the system. Anyway, there are so many stories out there, business history stories that need telling. And there's another one in the book involving Carney, who, as I said, was then governor of the Bank of Canada. He had a major dust-up with Jamie Dimon, who was CEO of JP Morgan and is still CEO of JP Morgan, at an international meeting in front of hundreds of global bankers post-crisis to discuss addressing regulatory change. Anyhow, Rick was in between them. People in the room couldn't believe what they were seeing. You know, Dimon was going real hard at Carney. And Carney was having none of it. And elbows up. So mad he got up and left. And, I kind of had a sense he was going to go for the prime minister's job, because in 2024, when I was writing this, I sent him like 4 requests for, I never heard back. And I thought, okay, if you're running for prime minister, you don't want to be associated with a bank CEO, right? So anyway, Jamie Dimon did agree to an interview, and there's a funny story about that interview if you want to ask me about it in the Q&A, which I'm getting near that. So it's all in the book. It's history, and it tells us where we've been and hopefully helps us understand where we're going and to avoid past mistakes. I hope some of you here will tell these kinds of stories, promote these kinds of, or encourage these kinds of stories, but tell the ones you love, because that's the way to help make them the best that they can be, I think. So thank you so much for having me. And if you have any questions, I'm here. I know you.
I'm a Scotiabanker, and I love the book, I have to say. You know this.
Thanks, Malcolm.
I've read it twice.
Twice?
I've read it, twice. Once on my phone, once in a hardcover. I've handed out half a dozen copies.
Right on.
And I've read all sorts of other Scotiabank histories as well. And this does a better, not only is it just ripper, it's a really great read, but it tells us more about culture and risk management, I think, than any other book I've ever read about banking.
Thank you so much, Malcolm.
What I want to know is, why Scotiabank? Why Rick Waugh? Why? I mean, there's other bigger banks. You knew them all. Why brought you to Scotiabank and Rick's story?
Well, it's funny. I never expected it to happen. I didn't plan it. You know, I had in my mind that Hunter Harrison would be a good book, because I covered him for so long. Like I covered Rick, but with Hunter it was a battle, the biggest proxy fight we've seen in a long time, for CP, and I kept a lot of the documents from the time. I knew Ackman, Cleghorn, and those people, and so that didn't surprise me that came along, but with Rick, I had no plan to write it. I didn't plan on writing another book about banking. I'd written the TD book, and I thought, okay, well, now do something else. And, you end up having conversations with a lot of different people. It's a lot of projects don't land, or they seem close, and then the main character scurries off because they do realize how much work is involved at their end, the commitment and time-wise and so forth, or they get nervous, or they think it'll dredge up. I'm thinking one in particular dredge up a lot of stuff that they didn't want to think about again, or whatever. So it's some you just dodge the bullet, frankly. You realize that it wouldn't have been good. It wouldn't have been one of those torture tests. But I'd stayed in touch with Rick after he left the bank and I left BNN around the same time, 2014. We had lunch once, I think, and we saw each other at some Canadian Business History Association events. we talked at, it was supposed to be a party for Red Wilson, and Red was sick at the York Club a few years ago, and we talked, and then Joe called. And I thought, well, you know, I always got along with Rick. I would never presume to be friends with these people, but, you know, you have cordial relationships, and, you know, we can talk and laugh together. And there was the trust because of 2 decades. And you know, I went up there to the cottage, and, you know, he's lying back in the chair. And you know, when I left, I'm always thinking, okay, is there a story here? And you know, with Charles Bronfman, you know, I remember sitting in his office in Montreal on Labor Day 2014, I think. And I said, well, you know, this is going to be a memoir, so we want, say, a dozen chapters, the real meaningful things in your life, not womb to tomb, you know. And so in 6 hours, you know, we kind of like fleshed out, okay, what are these chapters here, you know, and it kind of held as a structure, except for shuffling a couple. And then with Rick, you know, we talked about, over those few hours, talked about, you know, some of this, I kind of approached it the same way. And then I went back a week later, spent a few more hours, and then I thought, okay, I kind of feel a book coming on here, like a cold, you know, or the flu. And I'm driving back to Toronto, and I like to gather and then do something with it. You know, I don't get writer's block. I'm not one of those people, because I don't write something until I know something or think I know something. And so I came back, and, you know, I had some background in banking from the other book and the coverage over the years and some of the issues he was talking about, not the Raptors, but the financial crisis, certainly. Anyway, and you always write an outline, like a chapter outline. And so I wrote 10,000 words. I think of it as a test drive. I want to test drive this material. Do I have a feel behind the wheel here with this story? Even though, okay, stuff's going to be wrong in the outline, we can fix that after. But the basic thrust, can I feel it? And so I sat down and wrote 10,000 words, and I thought, yeah, I can, there's a book here. And so, and, you know, Rick and I, as I say, got along. He was very open to the idea. He said, I'll give you, you know, access to what you want. You can go through my files to the extent that they're not breach of client, you know, confidentiality or things like that. But it felt right. And so it all came together pretty quickly. It was not planned at all. But, you know, I loved the project. It was really, you know, despite a few bumps in the road, which always happen, you know, and Andrew was a great help intellectually. And, you know, you're kind of alone when you write these things. And you want, you know, until Penguin said, yeah, we're going to do this, which was, I don't know, December of 2024, you know, Andrew and I would talk about chapters, rough chapters that I'd written, and we'd sort of, you know, he was kind of, you know, my therapist a bit, and so and help in other ways, not to be flip about it. So that's kind of how it happened. No planning involved. And it's kind of nice when things are serendipitous in a way. Long answer, but yeah, sure. Yes.
Thank you for writing great books, and your first book, TD TD was one of my factors to join TD at that time.
Oh, okay.
Here, 2 people from TD.
Yeah.
So I think in short, I can say your reason for writing the book was Joe Martin, like as you said, Godfather.
Yeah.
So one of the things that with Joe, I was Joe's student when Norton was going through bankruptcy, so one of the case studies that we worked into, a couple of case studies we worked, it always came around sophisticated management. I'm sure Joe has talked about
Yeah.
diamond model and everything.
Yeah.
When I read Give Me a Crisis, it felt like Rick Waugh was one of those great example of sophisticated management. Even the TD, the banking in America, Ed Clark comes out as
Yeah,
example of sophisticated management.
sure.
So from your first question, from your learning how the TD is going right away, when are you writing the next book on TD?
You're not the first to ask that, and I'm not.
But broadly, from as a business historian, and you correctly pointed out, business history is a combination of a lot of international history,
Yeah,
history about the community as such. And we are living in a time where we need more of Canadian leadership.
yeah,
I love what Mark Carney as a Prime Minister gave a speech in Davos the other day.
yeah.
So where do you think, as a sophisticated management from your learning of business history, we are in Canada at this point, and what should we do going forward in business?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. Thank you. Well, yes, Rick was a very strong manager, for sure. And it's interesting, historically, the people that preceded him as CEO, and Malcolm knows better than me. So when he went to work there, it was Nix, who died. But then Cedric Ritchie became the CEO for 20 years. And then Peter Godsoe, and then Rick. Godsoe was what, about 10 years, something like that? And so Sabi Marwa, who was CFO, brilliant guy, and became number 2 to Rick, Chief Operating Officer, very generous with his time with me, said, Richie, he managed through fear. Those were the days of fear. And he scared the hell out of people. And Godsoe, he said, managed with intellect. And Rick managed through people. He somehow was able to, he was criticized as maybe not being disciplined, like disciplining people enough and so forth, and that changed when he left and so forth. But he had a different view. And the people in Argentina who I spoke to, who were key people there in this terrible crisis that was not only affecting the bank, the country where they worked, but their families. One guy who ran the retail system there said, I don't know what to tell my brother. My brother said, should I take money out of the bank because of what's happening? And bury it under a tree. So he's torn. He's, running the bank. He says, the retail, and if he says to his brother, take it out, he's ratting out the bank. Versus like protecting his, so he had that dilemma. So these were, and Rick was very calm and kind with these people, and they talk about that, and they were able to, which is not really the broad view of how people like him operate, but Hunter Harrison had a very different leadership way. He was intimidating. He'd rip your head off. At the same time, he was brilliant in terms of running a railroad, but he was funny, he was generous, he was a lot of things, like most people are, a kaleidoscope of things, but he was also a mentor and a coach, so he trained people too. But if you weren't on Team Hunter, you were out. There was no flex there. But to your broader question, and I know it's a long run-up to it, about management now, I have this, and I might write an op-ed about it. For years we've been hearing about this productivity issue in Canada. I believe it's serious. Okay, so you got a productivity issue. Keeps going down. Why does compensation keep going up for CEOs? It's, you guys are running the country, the business of the country, and productivity's going down. So why, and I like almost impishly, mischievously, might suggest, okay, make national productivity a major criteria for the compensation committee. for the TSX 60 and tie it to 75% of your compensation. You want to see productivity go up? Phew! Right? I think there's a disconnect here. I mean, look, they're smart people. They work really hard. 24/7 job, huge responsibility. But there's a disconnect, and they deserve merit pay. I'm a believer in merit pay. I'm not a believer in obscene, what's the word? Separation or disparity. Thank you, between top and shop floor or average employee. So I think they're all CEOs are always blaming the government for productivity, but they never look. They never say, "Geez, maybe we could manage things a little better or a little differently." So that's my answer.
It's a very great point. Even in the case of Nortel, we felt that Dr. Paul Stern, who was the first American CEO of Nortel, his compensation was tied to the stock price.
What was his name?
Dr. Paul Stern.
Oh, Paul Stern. Yeah,
Paul Stern.
right.
So he was the first one tied with the bottom line, not with the top line.
Yeah,
And that factored in how we spent on R&D decreased.
right.
So that's a great point. Like this productivity, if that is the issue, then we have to tie the compensation of top management with the bigger things.
Other questions? I don't know how my time is, but
We're at 6 right now. So
okay. One more.
Yeah.
And then I have to run.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi.
Really great talk. Really enjoyed hearing you talk about how you put your books together and how you're able to keep. But I just had one question, and it was about the trust that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Interviewees, I guess. Did they have a final veto over the book?
No.
Okay.
No.
That's good.
Yeah. Cool.
Quick follow there.
Yeah.
How many times have you gotten down the path and you're working with Andy and you're like, "All right, I got a skeleton here, and this is not interesting at all. Like, this is so boring that I don't think it's going to
Well, I got a few in the drawer. Like everybody's got a few in the drawer. But yeah. I mean, the answer actually is no, because I'm pretty careful. My wife would say I'm too careful, but I never told Rick this, but Lynn said to me, my wife, Lynn said, "You're going to waste your time? Like, I don't know." Like, it's like, anyway, I just said to her the other day, "You were wrong about that one. She's been right about others." And actually, she's, often the first reader of things. She just has a great eye, and she's a huge help to me. I'm pretty careful because I don't want to get to that point when you're in, and I was that way with documentaries too. Oh boy, you don't want to be, you're alone, and you got to finish it, and torture. So far. But thank you, everybody, so much.
Thanks a lot, Howard, for a wonderful talk. I will also want to formally thank everyone here for attending, and reminders to stay tuned about upcoming CBH talks and events. And so I think without further ado, we will adjourn the annual meeting. I don't know if I need a mover for that. Let's make it formal. Ryan, move. Who wants a second? Dawn, Nurbis, and vote to adjourn. There you go. Thank you very much. See you next year or online in the meantime. Oh, yes. So complimentary copy.